Welcome everyone. We are in this talk by Professor Konrad Ott, is part of the Normative Energy Ethics lecture series. So today we have Professor Konrad Ott. I will be chairing the session for questions after Professor Ott's talk. So if you have any questions for later after the talk, you can raise your hand. You can also post them in the chat. But first, my colleague Giovanni Frigo will introduce Professor Ott briefly, and afterwards we can start.
Yes, thank you, Laura. So I'm Giovanni, and I'm going to say a few words about Professor Ott biography and teaching commitments and research interests. So he was born in the late 50s, studied philosophy, history, and German at the University of Frankfurt Main. He received his doctorate there in Frankfurt in 1989 with a thesis on the origin and logic of historical science. A conference in Norway on the topic of ecology and ethics, we are talking about the 1990, sparked his interest in what was then a very new branch of practical philosophy called environmental ethics, which has been a long-standing engagement for him. From 1991 to 1993, he was a member of the Graduate College Ethics in the Sciences at the University of Tübingen and near Stuttgart, that is still ongoing, by the way. From 1994 to 1995, he worked there as a substitute professor, and then he habilitated at the University of Leipzig in 1995. From 1996 to 1999, he worked on the research project Technology Assessment and Ethics in Switzerland at the University of Zurich, together with Barbara Skorupinski. And this is also a nice connection to our own institute, so the Institute for Technology Assessment here in Karlsruhe. And after these academic posts in Tübingen and Zurich, Professor Ott was appointed the first German professorship for or in environmental ethics at the University of Greifswald in 1997. We move a bit forward in 2012, he then accepted an endowed professorship in philosophy and ethics of the environment at the Christian Albrecht University in Kiel, in northern Germany, where he is still working. There he has been working within the philosophical seminar and in several research groups, among which I would like to mention the Kiel Marine Science and the Cluster of Excellence entitled or called Roots, like the roots of the trees. Yeah. His teaching focuses primarily on environmental ethics, theories of justice, sustainability studies, critical theory, and discourse ethics. His main research priorities over the years have been climate engineering, storage of highly radioactive waste, also topics that are worked on here at ITAS. So there is this nice overlap overall. Conflicts in the energy transition, which is also a nice connection to the topic of our lecture series here. Marine protection, hence my reference earlier to the Kiel Marine Science Project, and natural climate solutions. His current research interests concern a social theoretical foundation of a transformation towards a sustainable post-growth society. And I think he typically likes to stress that he is interested in a strong notion of sustainability, as some of his publications also follow this expression. Yeah? From a public engagement or political standpoint, he was involved in the environmental movement since the early 1970s, and he served in different organizations connected to that. During this time, he developed together with Ralph Döring a theoretical concept of strong sustainability, which was successfully underpinned then later by an actual research program. Personally, as a PhD student, I encountered his work when I read the entry about environmental ethics in the new online Philosophy of Nature that was published in 2020. And it was such a refreshing perspective while being also a useful overview of the field. So the scholarly profile of Professor Ott, we think here in PhilETAS at ITAS at KIT fits perfectly this lecture series, which is about energy ethics, as you already know, as his scholarship or scholarly profile bridges environmental ethics technology assessment, and climate ethics. And indeed, his talk today is entitled, as you already know, 10 Domains of Climate Ethics. And we hope it will provide part of this lecture series, or I'm sure it will provide good food for thought. Professor Ott, thank you for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Frigo, for inviting me and for the very, very nice introduction. Today, I will speak about the basics of climate ethics, which has been a focus in Kiel since a couple of years. And this is organized as 10 domains of climate ethics. The domains start with a portfolio perspective. Then I will rush through concerns about impacts. I will have to say some words on the relationship between climate economics and ethics. And then I will turn to stabilization level of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. And domain number 5 deals with distribution of remaining emission entitlements or budgets. And then I will ask about our historical responsibility for past emissions, and then turn to the problem of adaptation and the very special and hard case of displaced persons. Finally, I turn to more technological topics as carbon dioxide removal, including natural climate contributions. And finally, solar radiation management, which has embarrassed me for years. Finally, I will present what I regard as a prudent, a morally decent portfolio. And then, if I have some time, I will say some words about hypermorals and climate ethics. As Steve Rainier has stated already at the turn of this millennium, the issue of climate change is ultimately an ethical issue, or you might say, a matter of justice. Climate ethics is a title for ethical reflections on moral issues of climate change, and it is or has become a very complex field of inquiry in different resorts, topics, or as I prefer to say, domains. A comprehensive climate ethics then would be a consistent and coherent network of reasonable and defendable claims in each domain. And of course, climate ethics as a part of applied philosophy presumes to give some moral yardstick for climate policy making. The portfolio perspective includes abatement, that means curbing emissions on different scales, decarbonization of the economy. It entails adaptation, coping with climate change in different regions, the problem of displaced persons, and the nut of adaptation financing. It includes also carbon dioxide removal. There are different technology included here, and maybe a mean of the last resort, solar radiation management, especially sulfate aerosol injections into the stratosphere. And this portfolio, because portfolio originally stems from economic theory, this is not an economic portfolio, it is a portfolio to be interpreted on moral or ethical grounds. I think domain number 2, there are sound reasons to be highly concerned about the impacts of climate change. I will not rush through all these topics as sea level rise, change in thermohaline circulation, extreme event, precipitation patterns, water stress, and so on and so on. Of course, we are deeply concerned about positive feedbacks and tipping point, which might spur a runaway climate change. So I take for granted that there are sound reasons to be highly concerned. Domain number 3, it was William Nordhaus and Richard Toll who tried to calculate an optimal, efficient climate policies over a century or even longer. My claim is that one cannot escape ethics by doing economics because there are so many hidden value judgments in economic models. If you are familiar with the so-called Stern report, you will see that the Stern report includes a debate on critical assumptions in economic modelings as the rate of discount, but there are others as well. Policymakers often are ignorant about these ethical assumptions in cost-benefit analysis, since they are only interested in this dollar number outcomes, and they say, okay, we should better listen to economics, not to ethicists, but the ethicists will point at the implicit ethics within economics as the rate of discount by which future costs and utilities are discounted. But there is a problem of the marginal utility of future additional commodities as well. There are problems in curving the damage functions. Do you suppose nonlinear damages thresholds, or do you prefer a linear, very simple damage function? How do you monetize different impacts which have different meanings in different cultures? How are you assess the costs of socio-political consequences as migration, riots, political instability? How do you calculate the costs of health risks? And how do you deal with a problem? What is the monetary value of a statistical human life? And of course, how do you monetize ecosystem services and the benefits of biodiversity? You can do it by willingness to pay, or you can do it by willingness to accept, and you will get different results. I think the approach to find an optimal or efficient economic solution for the climate portfolio is deeply flawed and should be discarded. We should better adopt a so-called standard price approach in climate change economics. And the supreme standards or objectives, boundaries, targets must be set with moral and with scientific prudence, and they must be set by the conference of parties, the climate community, so to say. And then the economists might calculate the least possible costs of reaching such target. Almost 20 years ago, me and some colleagues did an ethical interpretation of Article 2 of the UNFCCC, which tells we should prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate change. And this analysis comes to the result that most current ethical theory propose very low stabilization targets. There is a kind of ethical convergence in this respect. The WVGO proposed a 2-degree target global mean temperature as a so-called tolerable window. 2 degree means compared to pre-industrial temperatures. And this tolerable window approach has been substantiated by the Holocene argument by the Environmental Advisory Council in 2019. The Holocene temperature range was a comfort zone for human culture. And stepping out of this geological comfort zone brings us into maybe highly uncomfortable terrains. In Paris, 2016, well below 2 degrees is a mandatory global boundary. So not 2 degrees, but well below 2 degrees. A lot of literature proposes that well below 2 degrees should mean 1.5 degrees as an ideally desirable boundaries. And in the climate summit of Glasgow, this 1.5 degree objective has been confirmed. So we are in this range between 1.5 and 1.8 global mean temperature. And this range is, given the global emissions, highly ambitious. The German Green Party takes 1.5 degree as mandatory, but we should not forget it's a global objective. It doesn't matter at which location a ton or a gigaton of CO2 will be released. So we urgently need compliance by the community of states, if there is such a thing as a community of states, United Nations or something like this. I'm skeptical about it. "450 parts per million CO2 equivalent seems to be a prudent, feasible upper limit for atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration." But this 450 parts per million will perhaps remain within this range 1.6, 1.8 degrees. It will reach well below 2 degrees. But this objective is almost out of reach. We will reach it in a couple of years, and nobody believes that the world will be climate neutral within 10 or 20 years. The reasons are clear. It took far too long to push climate change top of political agendas. And therefore, there will be some overshoot according to all credible scenarios. An overshoot in atmospheric concentration and an overshoot in temperature as well. One has to realize that the carbon budget, the remaining global carbon budget, dramatically shrinks if one wishes to reach 1.5 degrees with some likeliness of 66 or 75%. So it makes a big difference whether we will have 1,000 gigaton left in our budget, this is 2 degrees, or only 400 gigatons, which remains if we adopt a 1.5 degree. So if we adopt a 1.5 degree target, then our global budget will be over in 10 years or less than 10 years. Let's take a look on the global emissions. We see the European Union has reduced 23%. Germany has reduced 40% in 2022. The US have remained constant over time. India has increased from a very low per capita emissions, but has tripled. The Near East has strongly increased. China is now about 11 gigatons, a strong increase, and the rest of the world has increased as well. And my take-home message here is, don't underrate rest of the world emissions. They contribute more and more. The 11 gigatons of China are as much as the world emissions in the 60s. Domain number 5. If the atmosphere must be seen as a scarce thing, according to a supreme objective, there is a problem of distributive justice with respect to tolerable remaining greenhouse gas emission. And these tolerable emission entitlements, the budget, must be calculated and it must be distributed according to some principles and criteria. There is a divide in the theory. One can distribute the remaining resources, that's Aubrey Meyer, or one can distribute burdens. Simon Caney. Simon Caney says we should not just search for a fair solution for the climate problem, but we must see the climate problem in conjunction with the many types of injustice and disparities and inequalities in the world. If you adopt more the resource approach, then there is a remaining global carbon budget to be distributed. And I would add a pro-poor requirement. Any distribution should be beneficial to the poor, especially the poor in the global south. These criteria have been debated since the second assessment report of the IPCC. I would say there is a very inspiring debate between per capita egalitarian approaches and the greenhouse development rights. I'm in the camp of a per capita approach, and my argument in a nutshell goes like this. I would say the atmosphere is one single sink for greenhouse gases. It is a common pool good. And there is a presumption in favor of equality in most theories of distributive justice, as in Rawls, as in Tugendhat. To me, this presumption is prima facie adequate in the case of common pool goods. If so, then a burden of proof, a fair burden of proof, falls on the side of unequal distribution of entitlements. And unless this burden will be met, a per capita scheme is regarded as being fair enough. Maybe not ideally fair from a holistic approach, but fair enough from a resources approach. Christian Bartz and myself have written a very long article on justification and feasibility of a per capita approach. Conclusion: any human being is entitled to emit less than 2 tons, and we all must go a trajectory to become net zero in the next decades. So Germany is on a pathway from 10 tons per year and persons. This was in the 90s and later, to net zero till 2050 or 2045, or even quicker, more rapid. So time plays a role. But China, meanwhile, has reached the European Union on a per capita base. And very worrisome is the role of the BRICS states: Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, India, China, South Africa, because one can see in the context of the war in Ukraine, new carbon coalitions, and now Russia is pumping cheap oil to many states. And then, of course, there are countries, middle income countries as Turkey, Nigeria, Pakistan, Morocco. I would say more than 60 countries in the world are carbonizing themselves right now. And the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 proposes access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services to all human beings. This is electricity for all. And perhaps it is mission impossible to reach 1.5 global mean temperature with close to 10 billion people under the SDG 7. Is a conflict. It's a conflict between, it's a conflict even inside of the SDGs between the climate target and SDG number 7. Domain number 6, how to calculate our historical responsibility. There is a concept of the ecological debt that's reasonable. States are somehow responsible for what happened in the past. I would not deny this completely. The greenhouse gas emission took off in the Western and Northern world around 1830, so 200 years of emission roughly. But one has to distinguish between causal and moral responsibility. Should people have care about emissions in previous times? Could they have known better? Should the article of Svante Arrhenius at the turn to the 20th century, should it have been a must read in the beginning of the 20th century? Nobody was reading the articles. There are high uncertainties of calculating past emissions. Try to calculate the past emission of USSR. There have been regime shifts and responsibility. GDR has had the highest per capita emissions in the world. But, and this is an important point, almost 50% of all emissions occurred in the last 40 years. Since human beings know that they are causing climatic change, they have increased the emission by far. So 50% in the state of knowledge and 50% in the state of ignorance. If I take 1990 as a baseline year for historical emissions, I would say, okay, 50% have occurred afterwards. I mean we, the citizens of the Western states, we are in some sense the beneficiaries of the process of industrialization and colonialization, which created many, many externalities. So I adopt the beneficiary argument by Axel Gosseries. A readiness to abate our own emissions and a readiness to assist countries in the global south seems mandatory out of justice, not out of generosity. And then there are principles at stake. Polluter pays, fair enough. Everybody has to contribute a fair share. Beneficiary principle, it's fuzzy, but reasonable. And then there is another principle, the so-called ability to pay principle, which is clearly a non-fault principle. Even if you have not made a moral fault, you should pay simply because you have the financial ability to do so. And of course, one can combine all principle to hybrid account. Christian Bartz has done so. And now we are in a situation that we have to design a global adaptation fund regime. In Kiel, we have a research project on this. But this is really a sophisticated and messy topic. What is the relation of global adaptation to development aid? Is it strictly additional? Should there be bilateral or international schemes, partners or global pools? Which states have to pay how much into this fund? According to which criteria? How much money is needed each year? 100 billions, 300 billions, a trillion, or even more, because adaptation is a cross-cutting topic in each society. And there is a litany in the literature that 100 billion, even 200 billion would be grossly insufficient. According to which output criteria the money should be spent? How can success and failure be measured? How can an adaptation funding scheme be secured against strategic misuse and corruption? It's a lot of money, and many agents want to receive money out of the fund. And then, of course, displaced persons are, to my mind, a hard case of adaptation, which needs a special regime under the United Nations. Let's say a word about monetary input. We will see 100 billion US dollar annually since 2025. We can ramp it up in the years to come, but we should not start with 500 billion. We must be more experienced how it can work. A problem is that the national intended contributions of many states in the global south are conditional on sufficient adaptation financing. So there is conflict ahead. Should it be strictly additional to development aid, or might unified schemes with more money be legitimate? And of course, here, as always, we face the problem of non-compliance. Some countries will simply refuse to pay in. And should the well-minded countries pay the share of others, or should they pay their fair shares, but not more? Non-compliance is the underlying problem of reaching the target, financing, and so on and so on. So we are in a situation of non-compliance. The criteria of how to spend the money are vulnerability, but vulnerability has the incentive that countries in the global south will have to present themselves as being highly vulnerable, ignorant, helpless. And I'm, on reflection, not sure whether vulnerability is a ideal criteria in a post-colonial situation. Efficiency, we would not just waste money. Democracy, in democratic states, maybe the people have a say how the money will be spent. Of course, I would propose a strong sustainability criterion, and I would like to see natural climate solutions as a criterion. At the moment, I'm writing a research proposal on adaptation projects in Nigeria. Displaced persons, I said, a special case of adaptation. On conceptual grounds, there is persecution, there can be escapement out of poverty, and there can be displacement. I would say the climate is not a persecutor. People are displaced out of climatic change. We have the paradigm case of the small island states in the Pacific region, but we have problem with coastal zones all over the world, from the Philippines till Ecuador, because worldwide people are moving, migrating to the coastal zones where the risk of extreme event and sea level rise increases. We see frequency and intensity of extreme events, but we also see slow environmental degradation, moisture of the soil, deforestation, desertification, water stress. So, and then the problem is from which point onwards one can say now degradation is as heavy and I have to migrate to other regions. Exposition to hazard measures, and we face a problem of preventive displacement because the models point to places on planet Earth where in the future, maybe in 20, 30, 40 years, life conditions will be impoverished. Some people claim that the small island states should be given new territories to found new states, but then some states should give territory away. Given these problems, the numbers of climate refugees or displaced persons are more concept dependent than reality dependent. It depends very much on the definitions, the criteria, the thresholds, and the like. I come now to the domain of climate engineering. There are a lot of technologies as fertilizing oceans, atmospheric carbon dioxide removal with a lot of technologies inside. Some have proposed space disks or reflectors, but I think this is a quite silly Star Trek idea. We could try to pump seawater into the atmosphere to modify cloud cover over sea, but we need then a lot of pumping ships in the ocean. We could go for ocean upwelling, bringing cold water close to the surface, and we can try to go for enhanced weatherings at coastal zones. And we could go for sulfate aerosol injection into the stratosphere, which would mimic volcano eruptions that cool down planet Earth. And the proponents argue cheap direct costs, according to some calculation, immediate effects, technologies available, unilateral action possible, tempting as substituting mitigation or abatement, but highly risky. The domain number 8 is carbon dioxide removal. And here we see bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which could bring negative emissions in the second half of the century. But this is a large scale technology, and it competes with food production for land and water. So it shifts risk for food security into the future. So I see it highly critical. Large-scale BECCS technologies are repugnant. Then, of course, we have natural climate contributions, reforestation, not afforestation, but reforestation, wetting bogs and peatlands, first stop the CO2 emission from degraded bogs and then have growing peatlands again. We can go for more organic agriculture and increase the carbon content in the soils. My proposal is we should start natural climate solutions or contributions in temperate zones right now, where competition over land is not so dramatic. At the moment, we have a research project on potential for the federal states of Schleswig-Holstein and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. Domain number 9, and I move to the end. Solar radiation management, research and deployment. There are some arguments on the pro side, arming the future, responsibility to research on this solar radiation management option, at least research. The argument from economic efficiency, the argument from lesser evil compared to unmitigated climate change, it might be the lesser evil. The argument, it might be needed in an emergency situation, but this emergency argument has been rejected by Silman et al. Or the buying time argument, There is an analysis by Friederike Neuber and myself. Friederike Neuber has written a PhD thesis at KIT a couple of years ago on the logic of the buying time argument. All remaining arguments, and I think the buying time argument is the most promising one, they have as an agreement, solar radiation management can only work as a complement to decarbonization, not as a substitute. Here in my research project, I worked on contra-arguments. It's a risk transfer to the future. There will be a termination problem. Can we stop it? Do we have an informed consent if unilateral actions is not permissible? And will there be a moral hazard? Because, okay, if people think, okay, we will go for solar radiation management, then we have no incentive to abate and mitigate. Maybe some political economies are closer to SRM than others. I had a critical eye on the US, but Donald Trump didn't believe in climate changes at all, and so it didn't have to go for solar radiation management. There is the argument that we will have a loss of intangibles. Maybe the blue sky will not be perfectly blue again, and we shall not see the bright stars at night as we do it right now. And maybe there can be also a secular variant of the old hybrid argument, meaning that solar radiation management can come out of control, and we should not overrate our capacities. Finally, I can present my prudent and morally decent, or so I hope, portfolio. Strong priority for abatement, decarbonization worldwide. But if I take a look on the global emissions, I can preach this, but the numbers go in the opposite direction. And compliance is key. Well below 2 degrees is mandatory. 1.5 degrees is an ideal objective, but this is almost out of reach. We should go under a per capita criterion for convergence in the per capita emissions till 2050. As a member of the Environmental Advisory Council, I have, with colleagues, argued Germany should take a forerunner role. And this forerunner role should be reloaded. But of course, under conditions of warfare, boycott, this is easy to say and hard to perform. I think the EU Green Deal, despite deficiencies, deserves support. And as I said, we as beneficiaries should be generous with adaptation financing out of a sense of justice. My criteria would be vulnerability in a specific way, sustainability, strong sustainability, natural climate solutions as criteria. We will need resettlement programs for displaced persons, where these resettlement programs will occur. I do not know. I do not know. We will go for natural climate solutions, and we will test some bags, maybe first in the temperate zones. And sulfate aerosol injection, there is the option either research for a buying time scenario or ban it all together. For a couple of years, I would say, let's ban it completely. It's too risky. But meanwhile, there are some voices coming out of the global south that climate change is so traumatic that we might need it for a couple of time as ultima ratio. But at the moment, I would remain in the camp of the persons who would ban it all completely, because I think we cannot in the long term control it, and we will have a real termination problem. So it is a kind of a gambling, and Hans Jonas has warned us against such global high stake gambling. Of course, some people said high technology, renewable energies, fair enough, but renaissance of nuclear energy worldwide. We have a new debate. Large-scale bags with genetic engineering and maybe irrigation made from converted salt water. Sulfate aerosol injection for buying time. Marine cloud brightening, some technological fix to prevent melting of glaciers, of course, genetic modified organisms for agriculture, and maybe assisted evolution in nature conservation. So this would be not but it is a possible high technology portfolio as an alternative. My final slice is about the radicalization of climate morals or climate ethics. It is claimed we are in an emergency situation. We need an emergency ethics, Klimanotstand. A little bit as Carl Schmitt, souverän ist, wer über den Ausnahmezustand entscheidet. We must reach 1.5 degrees with 80% certainty at almost all costs suddenly. We need a net zero warfare program. Christian Peukert, Klimaneutralität jetzt. We need radical pro-poor solution. Greenhouse development right, as Daryl Mullendorf and Simon Caney demand. We need to finance adaptation by an ability to pay principle, tax the global rich. So we need at least $500 billion annually into adaptation funding, strictly additional to development aid. And perhaps we, the wealthy people of the North, should try to decarbonize the global South by real transfers, not by investments, not by credits, but by transfers stemming from our capital, from our wealth. So we should not just become net zero as soon as possible, but we should transfer a lot of wealth into the global South, but should do so strictly in a post-colonial attitude. We should recognize the climate refugee status and should open the borders or give permits of recognized climate refugees. We should devote some of our territories for the small island states. And if this won't work, we should at least go for actions of civil disobedience. This is a Rawlsian approach, but we may either demand a right to resistance that goes beyond civil disobedience. So I see a lot of radicalization. The situation in Germany right now, there is a lot of apocalyptic reasoning and campaigning, and there are people who say stubborn reformism to become net zero. Germany has now 1.8% of the global emissions. We have reduced 40% due to Corona, and now we'll start phasing out coal. Phasing out coal in latest 2038 minus, hopefully, some years. I'm not sure whether we can do it 2030, but I would say 2038 minus some years. This is ambitious because this is only 16 years after phasing out or having phased out nuclear energy. So we are in a post-nuclear energy situation and wish to phase out coal, and then we have nothing left than maybe some liquid natural gas and the renewables, geothermy, and so on and so on. But we have to have energy safety for now 85 million people. Maybe Germany will have an increase in population. Maybe in 2038, we will have 90 million people population. We will have to phase out combustion engines. But meanwhile, most of the low-hanging fruits have been already plucked. And the further you go, the more difficult it will be. The dispute over the law how to heat our houses in the future is just a first instance that now it becomes more costly. And it will become even more costly if we turn to the residual emissions in the health sector and in agriculture. So climate neutrality, yes, as soon as possible, but when? I would like to see at the end of my mortal life to live in a net zero continent, the European Union, and to live in a net zero country, maybe 2045 or even a bit earlier. These are the domains. You see the challenges. There are not so good news. Thanks for listening, and I hope for an intense debate. Thank you very much.